the idea of increased regulation formally of whistleblowing complaints is something that a lot of organisations have had to deal with in the last few years. A lot of organisations now have to have formal whistleblowing policies and an infrastructure that is in place in relation to that. And that sits on top of, or may sit on top of, or separate to, whatever might have been the existing complaint handling procedures and policies that an organisation has already had in place. So, for example, if an employee considers that they've been bullied or sexually harassed or subjected to other unwelcome conduct while at work, they don't have to go down the path of making a whistleblower complaint. They can do that. They can just make that complaint internally to a more senior manager, to the company's human resources department, etc. What's really interesting about the current environment is that largely off the back of this increased regulation of whistleblowing complaints, organisations are adopting a far more rigorous, conservative and cautious approach to dealing with complaints regardless of how they are generated. So not just are they adopting that rigour to formal whistleblowing complaints, they're adopting that often in relation to everything. And to your point earlier, employees have historically been very apprehensive about making complaints because they don't necessarily have a huge amount of trust, not just the process, but what the outcomes might be for them. And indeed, what might be the outcomes for other people as a result of that complaint being looked into.
So I guess there are considerations here. What if a business or an organisation has no complaints mechanism in place, at least that the employees know about it? An employee who would then looking to raise a complaint must consider, do they raise that internally or perhaps go externally?
That's right. And what we are seeing happen more is that even fairly low-level complaints, and by low level I'm talking about conduct that wouldn't sit at the more extreme ends of, say, bullying or harassment, are now being escalated through the whistleblowing infrastructure, if an organisation does have that, because the employees feel, rightly or wrongly, more confidence in the processes that attach to that. And the fact that maybe a board's going to be made aware of it, or any number of other things. If an organisation doesn't have a policy to deal with complaints, that's a big watch out. Even organisations that are small employers should really think about what is a person going to do if they feel as an employee that they have been bullied at work. If it's a small business, only 5 or 6 people who might be working there, it's highly unlikely and probably going to be very uncomfortable for that employee to raise that issue internally. So small organisations should think about how can they work with external service providers, for example, and that's a really positive message that they can provide to their organisations.
So does an employer have an obligation to conduct an inquiry if a complaint is raised?
So this is a really important question. I think a lot of employers are taking the approach now where they say, we are going to investigate everything, and often we're going to adopt a full belts and braces approach, regardless of what our assessment might be of the seriousness or otherwise of a complaint. I provide slightly different advice to my clients in relation to this, and the advice that I provide is that pragmatism must come first. Absolutely, we are in an environment of increased legal regulation and scrutiny, absolutely, and that needs to be respected. But what I see happen far too often is that organisations are applying a sledgehammer to a walnut approach to everything. And so what they are forgetting to do is apply perspective and pragmatism in terms of their response. So if someone, for example, says, I don't like the way someone spoke to me at work this morning. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's appropriate conduct. I'm not saying that that's something that everyone should have to put up with. But on any assessment, if that's the only thing a person is upset about or concerned about, that's a very low-level complaint to be making. Now, if that employee uses a company's whistleblowing infrastructure, for example, and through a hotline or some email escalation raises that issue, I mean, is a company seriously going to be appointing an external investigator at enormous cost and time and effort and energy for something that is so low level? And this is where organisations need to be more pragmatic. They need to make an assessment of what have we been made aware of here? How bad is it, even if true? If at its highest, it would not represent a serious breach of any policy, well, let's apply a proportionate response. And this is something that employers must get better at doing. Otherwise, as I'm seeing happen far too often, they make the investigation process an institution. And there's going to be too much collateral damage as a result of doing that.
How does a business or organisation make that decision? I guess it may well depend on the size of the business as to whether, if they proceed with an investigation, whether they do it internally or bring in an independent investigator.
That's right. It will depend on the size. It will depend on their sophistication. It will depend on their previous experience. I mean, sometimes even small organisations, just because of a previous experience they've had, are actually some of the most diligent and responsible employers, because they've seen what happens if they don't apply that diligence and responsibility. But organisations need to, first and foremost, understand what is the person who is making the complaint looking for and wanting. And that's a conversation that they should absolutely feel comfortable having if they have access to the complainant directly. So sitting down with someone and saying, yep, I understand that you're making complaints about these behaviours. I understand that you're using labels of bullying or discrimination or harassment or whatever else. But what I want to understand is what are you wanting to achieve from this process? Do you just want this to stop? Do you want retribution? Do you want punishment? Do you want the person to be sacked? I mean, what is it that you want? And that exchange is actually really meaningful and very powerful. And ultimately, that's what the employment relationship needs to get better at doing, rather than the over-legalisation of the employment relationship.
And if that whistleblower feels as though their complaints have not been adequately addressed, what are their options?
Well, again, that's going to depend a little bit in terms of the organisation's whistleblowing policy. There are protections that whistleblowers receive at legislation at large. Certainly, if they feel or claim that they've been victimised as a result of making a complaint or escalating their matter, there could be more serious consequences. So these things do need to be handled carefully, but being handled carefully doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to an extreme in terms of your response. And your policies should give you the flexibility, if I'm advising employers, to allow for a more bespoke approach, having regard to the seriousness of what's being alleged.
And I guess on the other side of the coin, if an employer feels as though perhaps they're being unfairly targeted, perhaps by an aggrieved employee, what options does it have?
Well, that also is something that should be addressed in policies, and it should be made clear that if someone is found to have made complaints frivolously, vexatiously, maliciously, and where there's no merit to it, it's unsubstantiated, that there should be consequences, and will be consequences for employees who do that and cause a great deal of pain and suffering for their colleagues, and inconvenience at the very least for their employer.